Anand Naidu, and welcome to a special edition of The Heat. Leaders and representatives from nations across the world are gathering in New York for the United Nations General Assembly. They are discussing critical issues, including conflict, peace efforts, and development goals. And as the UN marks its 80th anniversary, reform and global governance are also on the agenda. We begin with Guy Ryder. He is the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Policy. Guy Ryder, thanks so much for joining us. As the United Nations marks its 80th anniversary of its founding, what do you see as some of the main challenges and opportunities as it tries to advance its founding goals, things like peace, development, human rights?
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember as we do approach this 80th anniversary that the record of the United Nations over these 8 decades has been one of extraordinary achievements. Just imagine, whatever the difficulties have been, what the world would look like if the United Nations had not existed, had not been able to do what it has done. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that delivering on the founding principles of the United Nations Charter, and you've mentioned them, securing peace and security, promoting development, protecting human rights, providing humanitarian aid. This has always been a difficult job. And perhaps today, the circumstances we're working in look more difficult than it's ever been in the history of the UN. But I think the reality is we've always had to contend with problems, contend with obstacles, and we've always found a way through. So I think the challenge today on this 80th anniversary is to continue with this record, not only of achievements, but of adapting to new realities, a world which is being transformed by many factors. Some are political, some are technological, some are more economic. The United Nations needs to move with these changing times, to reflect the world as it is today, not just the world as it was in 1945. And I think we're approaching our 80th anniversary very much in that spirit of modernization and improvement.
Now, the United Nations is also trying to strengthen global cooperation, as you point out, at a time when we see rising geopolitical tensions around the world. I mean, how do you build, or rebuild, I should say, trust between member states, especially at a time when, as we see, consensus is very hard to find?
Well, yes, consensus is quite difficult to find in many regards, and I'm afraid we've seen that very often. For example, in the UN Security Council, perhaps the most visible part of the United Nations in the public mind, the Security Council hasn't always been able to react together to respond to very important crises in the world. So we do need to rebuild this very intangible commodity, trust. And how do we do it? Well, not all of the answer lies, of course, in the United Nations. A lot lies in the field of bilateral relationships, things that happen elsewhere. But I think there are 2 things that the United Nations can focus upon as we do try to, as you've said, rebuild trust levels to levels which allow us to function effectively. One is we have to focus on results. People, I think, will believe in multilateralism, international cooperation, if it shows that it can produce the results that people want. If we're able to prevent and bring an end to conflict, if we're able to stimulate development that improves people's living standards, if we're able to get humanitarian aid to people who need it and protect their human rights. So we need to double down on the results that we generate in the United Nations. And the UN80 initiative, combined with the Pact to the Future that we adopted last year, can help us do all of that. But the second thing which I think the United Nations can do to build trust is in the field of dialogue. I think trust is generated, it's certainly my experience, trust is generated when people meet sincerely, listen to each other, and try to find common ground. When people stop talking to each other, stop listening to each other, then I think trust can very rapidly dissolve. And here is the United Nations' incomparable comparative advantage. We are the place where, by definition, the world comes together, even when they don't necessarily agree, to talk through difficult issues, to search for solutions. It can be a frustrating process, it can be a slow process, but it's an absolutely necessary process, because when you do sit together, when you do talk to each other, and when you make that genuine effort to find common ground, that in and of itself is a process that builds trust back. And that's what really the United Nations is all about.
Now, as you pointed out, we live in changing times, rapidly changing times, and one of the challenges we hear about, especially from developing countries, is that they are not given enough of a voice in global governance, that they are underrepresented, and that there is a need for reform of the global governance system. China, in fact, has come forward. It's come up with the Global Governance Initiative. We last heard about that at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization conference in Tianjin. How can those all work together to reform the system?
Yes, I think it is very frequently recognized by developing countries, but by others as well, that the governance systems we have in place in the world are unequal. They do not give sufficient space and voice to the developing and emerging countries of the world. And when the Secretary General was in Tianjin at the beginning of September, he welcomed the new governance initiative that China has launched as a way of addressing these issues. The United Nations and the Secretary General have also been vocal in calling for reform, for example, in the international financial institutions, where very clearly the developing countries who have an overriding interest in the way that those institutions operate, those developing countries do not have sufficient voice and influence in decision making. And we need to bring that same reflection back home to the United Nations. Regrettably, our governance systems too, I think of the Security Council in particular, really respond, or correspond, I should say, to the world of 1945, not to the world as it is 80 years later. So this imperative, and I think imperative is the right word, to produce more equitable, more fair governance systems. It's also a key to rebuilding the trust that we talked about a little bit earlier in our conversation. So we take governance reform very seriously. We welcome China's efforts in this regard, and we look forward to progress being generated by all of these efforts.
I also recently talked with Melissa Fleming. She is the UN Under-Secretary General for Global Communications, and I began by asking her to assess some of the key roles the UN has played so far.
I think our biggest accomplishment is preventing World War III. You know, the UN was founded 80 years ago to stop the world from ever seeing another world war, to prevent the scourge of war, as it says in the UN Charter, from ever happening again. And although the world has been plagued with conflicts and wars, there are countless wars we believe that we have prevented. There are countless wars that we believe through our mediation, that we have stopped, and also peace that we have kept through the presence of our peacekeepers. Beyond that, the humanitarian assistance that we have provided to millions and millions of people over the years has kept people alive and also allowed them to thrive. I think we're really proud of childhood vaccines that have been given to millions and millions of children all over the world and have actually eradicated diseases like smallpox and really stopped many of the worst diseases in their tracks. There's also, you know, a lot of, on the technical side, global cooperation in telecommunications, in preventing nuclear proliferation and promoting nuclear safety. So there's so many examples that we're really proud of, and we're going to be taking this opportunity of our 80th birthday to reflect back on that. But I think what's really important is that we're not just kind of acting like an 80-year-old organization that is wise and experienced, but one that obviously in a completely changed world from what it was in 80 years ago when the United Nations was founded, to also use this opportunity to renew the United Nations, to make it more effective, efficient, reduce duplications, and manage at a time when we're receiving less funding than ever before.
Now, the global governance system is challenged by issues like the underrepresentation of the global south, lack of compliance with international law, and setbacks in sustainable development. At the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin, the Chinese president proposed the Global Governance Initiative. It's guided by the principles of sovereign equality, adherence to the rule of international law, and multilateralism. How can this initiative help the UN effectively address global governance issues?
Well, the Secretary General did participate in that summit. He has been concerned with impunity, the lack of adherence to the UN Charter and international law. So any proclamations and any efforts to bolster international adherence to the principles of the UN Charter are most welcome, as well as any boosts to helping us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We're 10 years in to the Sustainable Development Goals. We wanted them implemented much and had to have made much more progress than we have now. And so we need all the help that we can get along the way. Everybody. It's, the Sustainable Development Goals are for all countries and for all people. And there are all kinds of innovations and efforts that we welcome that can help us get there, to reduce inequalities around the world, to create a planet that is livable for all of us, more human rights, more justice, and we need all hands on deck at this point in time.
Time now for our panel. Joining me from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is chair professor at Soochow University. Also with us from Cape Town is Ebrahim Rasool. He is a former South African ambassador to the United States. And from Santiago, we are joined too by Jorge Heine. He is a former Chilean ambassador to China, and he's the author of the new book, The Non-Aligned World. Welcome to all of you. Victor Gao, let me start with you. The world is going through some major challenges right now. These are political challenges, economic challenges, technological challenges. As the United Nations marks its 80th anniversary, how much of a challenge is it for the organization?
Thank you very much for having me. I think we are celebrating the 80th year anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, which is truly a very momentous occasion, because I think the world today is at a crossroad, either for peace or war, for cooperation or stagnation, for example. So I think a lot of expectation is for the United Nations to play a very important role. On the other hand, I think there is high level of inefficiency in the work of the United Nations, and the fact that several countries have delayed their payment to the United Nations have made it's very difficult for the United Nations to really play a very positive role. On the other hand, I think we need to be very philosophical about the role which has been played by the United Nations since 1945, because after all, the world since 1945 has never suffered another scourge of a global war or world war, partially because of the nature of the United Nations Security Council, because the world established in 1945 was not meant to be a unipolar world. It was actually meant to be multipolar, with 5 permanent member states of the Security Council of the United Nations, each holding a veto power. That means we still need to really respect the original intent of the founding of the United Nations, and no country in the world, even a permanent member state of the United Nations Security Council, should be allowed to go solo, to dominate above other countries. I would say a lot of problems in the world of today are more related to the fact that some countries do not want to abide by the original intent of the founding of the United Nations, rather than the exact nature or the structure or the allocation of power within the United Nations itself. So I think we need to be philosophical. I think we need to work together to make up for greater efficiency of the United Nations on the one hand, but also to make sure that all countries should still rally around the United Nations and work for greater peace and avoid any single country from trying to go solo and try to dominate above the rest of the world and try to push the United Nations aside from the center of the world order that we are still living in.
Ambassador Rasool, there are growing calls from the global south, from developing nations, for them to play a bigger role in global governance, to have a greater voice. What is the view from Africa, and what are the kinds of reforms and changes you would like to see?
There is a clamor for the United Nations to reform, particularly the reform of the United Nations Security Council, to be firstly more inclusive. Africa is not represented. Latin America is not represented. And so we have the powers of the 1940s being the permanent members. And so that certainly requires enormous reform if there's going to be global inclusion. Secondly, I think the United Nations must loosen itself from financial dependence, particularly on the United States. And so Victor's point is very important. We must all pay our fair share so that the United Nations can get a semblance of independence and is not beholden to a single power who acts as a patron of a serial lawbreaker internationally. And then I think thirdly, what we need is the United Nations to have some kind of enforcement capacity. At this moment, it has moral authority, but no enforcement capacity. And so all the issues that we see going wrong in the world are the issues that the United Nations cannot patrol. And so it is no surprise that a superpower like the United States can denigrate the United Nations at the stage of the United Nations in this year's General Assembly. And so what we need is a United Nations that is indispensable. There's no doubt about it, but it needs to be able to be reformed and represent everyone. And secondly, it needs to be financially independent, because at this point it is being financially strangled. And thirdly, it needs an enforcement capacity so that the laws it makes can be supervised and can be implemented.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, he recently shared a report on what kind of progress has been made on the UN 80 initiative. Now, he has been, for a very long time, a proponent of a more coherent and a more effective United Nations. Ambassador Heine, what would countries like Chile like to see change?
Well, the basic issue that has been raised in these reports and by others that have looked at the UN reform has to do with the mandates. The United Nations in 2024 held something like 27,000 meetings. Out of those meetings came tens of thousands of mandates of things to do. Yet there is no systematic monitoring of what happens with those mandates, who actually follows up, some sort of inventory of what to do. Obviously, that is not something that we want to go on with, and reform is badly needed. I am of the belief that the United Nations should focus much more systematically on the three basic goals that it needs to serve: peace and security, development, and human rights. There's talk about consolidating a number of UN agencies. There are probably far too many of them, a real smorgasbord of agencies. There's talk about moving people from very expensive cities like New York and Geneva elsewhere. So all those things should be welcome. Now, having said all that, I would like to reiterate that multilateralism and entities like the United Nations are absolutely central to face the big challenges the world faces today. President Lula, in his speech, in his opening speech at the UN General Assembly this morning, the way he put it is, bombs will not protect us from the threat of climate change. And he is absolutely right. As we go on increasing defense spending, last year defense spending worldwide was $2.7 trillion, a record that has been going up for a very long time. And we are not doing the needful to protect us from such a significant challenge as climate change. Brazil, of course, will be chairing COP30 in a couple of months later this year. And Brazil is playing a very important role in fighting climate change because, of course, it is the Amazon country. And that, it seems to me, are the priorities we ought to keep in mind.
Right.
The sort of troubles of the United Nations should not detract us from the need for collective, concerted action to face these global issues. It's, of course, not just climate change. We're also facing unprecedented financial instability in many countries around the world. We're facing mass migration. We're facing things like pandemics. So some very serious global issues that cannot be solved by individual countries. So that is my take on the very significant role that the United Nations, despite its problems, it should continue to play.
Victor Gao, China has proposed a global governance initiative, and some of its core principles include abiding by international law and multilateralism. How can this contribute to a more effective system of global governance to create a world that is fairer, that is more inclusive?
I think from the Chinese perspective, we still see the world order we live in as centered around the United Nations. So China expects that the role of the United Nations, rather than weakened, should be further strengthened. And the United Nations really is a symbol of multilateralism and multipolarity, which should be fully respected. On that basis, I think international community should really work together, respecting each other and abide by the rules as contained in the United Nations Charter. Now, in this particular regard, what China wants to say is that we do not want to rock the boat. We do not want to change the international order. We just want to make sure that all countries in the world of today should respect the United Nations as the main body and abide by the multipolarity and multilateralism. Now, if we pursue our goals in this direction, China is pretty confident that all the problems in the world we are faced with can be better resolved. And the other panelists raised many other issues, which I also agree. But I think the fundamental problem in the world of today is whether you see the world as a multilateral place or as a unilateral place, whether you see multipolarity in the world or a single polarity, whether you should allow any single country to bully his way around to hold a gun at the heads of the other country, or, for example, whenever we meet and talk with each other, we respect each other, we abide by this multipolarity in the decision-making. And I think this is the core of what China is proposing as a global governance initiative.
Right. Ambassador Rasool, we hear about the challenges of engaging in more in-depth dialogue, in rebuilding trust. I mean, these are very polarized times. So how critical is it to adopt a more multilateral approach, the one that China has been proposing as part of its global governance initiative?
I think the Chinese initiative is absolutely critical because it contains two elements. The first element is that you've got to shift from international governments, coordinating nations, and global governance, coordinating global matters that affect the world, like pandemics and conflicts and climate. And so that's absolutely critical in the Chinese model. I also think that it says that multilateralism must be actively built. And so, for example, unfortunately, you're going to have to see it being built in sometimes opposition to a trade war. And so, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement is very critical in putting forward an antidote to a unilateral trade war. In much the same way, the BRICS multilateral initiative is moving from a developmental economic development agenda to a more global agenda that says, how do we assert the rights of the global South? And then there's been a wake-up call after the bombing of Qatar with the Qatar summit, and it endangers the Abrahamic Accord, and in a sense begins to say the region that is most affected by instability is beginning to stand up and to say we can't allow this to happen. And so, and in much the same way, the European countries that have been recognizing the existence of the state of Palestine is breaking with the Western consensus about Israel. So I'm saying that multilateralism sometimes has to be built in that kind of way so that we can create this multilateral world that is envisaged in the Chinese vision.
Right. Ambassador Heine, I've just got a little bit of time left, but there have also been calls for changes to other global institutions that came out of that were established after World War II. I'm talking about financial institutions. How great is the need for reform in these institutions?
Well, I will say this. The Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, were established, much as the UN was established to avoid World War III in 1945. The Bretton Woods institutions were established to avoid another Great Depression, which is something that contributed so much to triggering World War II. In that sense, taking the long view, you might say that they have succeeded in that. We have had all sorts of economics up and down, but we haven't had another Great Depression. So that's something that one ought to recognize about the Bretton Woods institutions. Now, that said, it is also true that they are not fully representative of the world today. They do not recognize the role that developing countries have played, and there's urgent need for reform for that. I would argue that it is probably easier to reform and change that than the membership of the P5 of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So perhaps we should focus on that.
Okay. Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all for this edition of our special UN series. Stay with us for more throughout the week. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington.